Autism spectrum disorder, part 2. Today we're talking about what causes autism. And for those of you who are new around here, we're only using good evidence-based science, no internet crap. My background is my original education was in human physiology and developmental biology and clinical research, then medical school to become a medical doctor, and then pediatric specific subspecialty. So if you got beef with what I'm saying, you better know your stuff. But before we get to the causes, it's really important to understand what we know about autism as a disorder and what it means to the brain. See, what we've learned over the last couple decades is that children with ASD, their brains are actually wired completely different. In fact, when compared with people who don't have ASD, we know that they have totally different volumes of white and gray matter. They have different anatomy of their smooth and curved parts of their brain. They have completely different chemical compositions of their brain. And their brain lateralization and neuronal networks are completely different than people who don't have ASD. This shows us that autism is not something that happens to somebody, it's something they're born with. It's a natural variation in humans that we see that's just as natural as difference in skin tone, hair color, or the size of your nose. And when we use the term autism spectrum disorder, we're only giving it a term to describe a pattern of behaviors that we can see. And that brings us to our first point of what causes autism spectrum disorder: genetics. In fact, we know from really good studies that up to 80% of people who are diagnosed with ASD have a genetic component or genetic cause of their ASD. Now, there is a hypothesis going around called the two-hit hypothesis that supposes that some people are more predisposed to have ASD-like behavior and that an in utero or early childhood exposure might bring that out. This has to do with a field of science called epigenetics, where genes can be modified based on external exposures. For example, some people are more likely to get skin cancer like melanoma, but if they don't ever have the UV radiation from the sun, they don't develop it. But if they have enough radiation and enough mutations, then they're more likely to develop melanoma. Now, we don't have as much good research about possible chemical compounds that may cause this epigenetic change that make autism spectrum disorder more likely to show itself. But we do have a few good studies I'll show you that show some things that may have a cause or may increase the likelihood of autism spectrum disorder, and we have some things that absolutely do not. Right off the bat, being born premature might increase your likelihood of having ASD behaviors later on in life. Similarly, other birth injuries such as neonatal sepsis, meconium aspiration, anoxic brain injury might increase the likelihood of having ASD behaviors as well. Another study shows advanced parental age, both in mother and father, might also be a factor. But that does not mean just because mom and dad are old or a baby's born premature, they are definitely going to develop autism spectrum disorder. It just means that if they already had a genetic predisposition and they had one of these events, it makes it more likely for them. Additionally, some medications that mom uses during pregnancy seem to possibly increase the risk. Some seizure medications might slightly increase the risk of developing ASD. Tylenol during pregnancy has gotten a lot of press, but the evidence is really still pretty weak and really needs additional research before we consider it a possible cause. And we have really good evidence that antidepressants do not have an association with ASD in the child. And the one you're all thinking about and waiting to see, vaccines. And that one has been proven over and over and over again with very good quality evidence that vaccines have nothing to do with the development of autism spectrum disorder. So it really all comes down to genetics. So what we see as autism spectrum is just a spectrum of human behavior, primarily dictated by genetics, but influenced by the birth and early environment of that child. But stay tuned for the future parts where we'll cover diagnosis, classification, and treatment. See you then.